podcast today. We have Lisa M. Lilly here, who is an author. Lisa was on the podcast, probably a couple of years ago now, I think. And so it's been a minute. Lisa, why don't you go ahead and just introduce yourself, who you are and what you do for anyone who doesn't know.
Yes, thanks for having me back. I'm really excited to be here. I write supernatural suspense and thrillers. I also have a detective mystery series, the QC Davis Mysteries, and I write under my clever nonfiction name, LM Lilly, the writing as a second career books for writers. I also host the podcast Buffy and the Art of the Story and do books based on the podcast. So just as we're speaking tomorrow, the latest in that series is releasing, and it's Buffy and the Art of Story, Season 3, Part 2, how to write characters that the audience loves or loves to hate, and plots that they can't put down. So that just came out. I'm also a lawyer, but very rarely.
You sound like you're a very busy, busy person. Lots going on.
Yes, lots going on, but actually less than there was last time I talked to you. So, which is why I thought it would be great to talk about that with you this time.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. That's one of the things we kind of want to address. So, why is it less busy? Do you just have fewer projects? And if so, did you do that purposefully? Or, talk to us a little bit about why there's less and how that came about.
It started in part the last time I appeared on the podcast. I feel like things were going great, and you and I had a terrific discussion about writing craft. And then, whenever the episode came out, your title for it was something like, fitting in writing in a chaotic life. And that makes sense because we talked a lot about how do you fit in time to write when, for example, you're working in a profession that maybe you don't have regular hours or you're working and
Right.
caring for kids and so forth. And when I started out publishing my novels and the writing as a second career site, that's where I was. I was running my own law firm. I was squeezing in my writing. But that word chaotic, my whole gut just like seized up. And I thought, well, what's that about? And, being who I am, I just ignored it and put my head down and just kept working. And my answer to everything really was, oh, I feel like I don't have enough time. I will just work harder. I will work all weekend. I'll skip all the fun things that I want to do. And I discovered maybe a year after that, I kind of ran into this wall. And I had been heading there for a while and not seeing it because for decades as a lawyer, it's very rewarded to work like that
Hmm.
and to just not question what you're doing and all your deadlines are set from outside. As someone who did litigation, so I had court deadlines, I had client demands, and those, of course, came first. But I realized I was treating myself as if that was still what I had to do professionally. And I think a lot of authors do this. We kind of put our heads down and, okay, I'm going to turn out more books, or somebody else is doing a podcast, so I'll do a podcast, or this person is coaching other authors. That's what I should be doing. And I realized I had taken on all these things and had become really unhappy and I wasn't even enjoying the fiction anymore, which is what I love to do the most.
Right. So, when you hit the wall, then what kind of changes did you make?
Yeah, I wish I could say I immediately recognized all this and made the right changes, but it took me months of feeling like everything was a slog. And I was talking to some non-writer friends and telling them what I was working on and what I was doing. And a couple of them said, maybe you need to let some of these things go. So I sat down and thought, what do I love the most? And at the moment it was nothing, but I thought about what did I love the most? And in the past, fiction writing for me, I know a lot of authors kind of struggle to sit down at the keyboard, but for me, it was my escape. When I was practicing law, that 1 hour I could eke out every week to write was this vacation. And I would take vacations and take a week off and just write. And I thought, all right, I feel like I've lost that. And maybe the problem is I'm still treating fiction like something I have to squeeze in after I get all my other work done. So a lot of times I kind of wasn't letting myself write because I hadn't finished this, checking my Amazon ads, or I hadn't posted on social media, or I was doing all these other things. So the first thing I did was just say, okay, every day if I can, some days I did have other responsibilities, but at least for 4 days a week, I would start out my day by writing fiction. And I started a different series. I'm doing a supernatural suspense series now, a brand new one. And it was really fun to go back to creating new characters and new settings and have a little magic in the world. And I didn't set any word count deadlines. I didn't set any production deadlines for that. It was just, I'm just going to sit down and work on what's fun. And then I took a look at what else I had. This was towards the end of 2023, and I created my word for the year was simplify. And everything I did, I looked at, can I make this simpler? Can I get rid of it? So one of the things I got rid of was I still have my writing as a second career site, but I thought I don't need to do blog posts here all the time. I'll just send things to my email list. And I had two email lists, fiction and nonfiction. I combined them with separate sections so it's clear if, people can skip over what doesn't apply. But I just send it out once a month and maybe now and then something extra for one of the lists. But everything I did, I looked at that. Um, and I cut out some of the ad platforms I was trying. I looked at what do I like best. I kind of find Amazon ads fun to work on try to make them work. And I stopped, trying to sort out Facebook ads. And I cut back on my BookBub dashboard ads unless I had a new release. So everything was how do I make it easier? And I took Sundays off. I made a rule, no work on Sundays.
Mhm.
Um, and I've pretty much stuck with that. And it really, that alone made a huge difference
Yeah.
because I gave myself time to just unwind. And it was really hard at first, but I let myself be bored. And it goes to something that you talked about with the unconscious mind, the importance of the unconscious mind. I hadn't given my unconscious mind any room to breathe.
Yeah, yeah. No, I really love everything that you're saying. The first thing I thought about when you were speaking is exactly that, the subconscious mind or the unconscious mind. It I feel like a lot of the reason that people struggle to get words onto the page when they sit down to write, I mean, I tend to explain it a little bit differently. Maybe they don't have their story planned out well enough to sit down and start, or maybe they haven't, specifically asked their subconscious mind about it. But I think another piece of it is that when we give ourselves time to relax and unwind, our mind naturally wanders, and then we're kind of, without even realizing it, playing in the subconscious mind. And if we don't do that and allow our creativity to just sort of populate, then it's going to be really hard to get words down. So have you found that it's any easier now? I mean, specifically the writing part, the creative part, now that you take more time to rest?
Yes, it is a lot easier and more fun because like you, for me, I always needed some amount of the story worked out in advance. And I had that in the novel I was working on, but was getting more stuck than I ever had. And yeah, now that I make that time to relax and I don't feel every second before I'm washing the dishes, I've got to put on a podcast about, whatever it is, the writing life or the business aspect of writing or writing craft. And I really consciously tried to allow some time where nope, no, no podcast in the background, just let my mind wander. So Sundays are that day for that. And also made time after that, started saying, okay, I'm stopping work at 5:30. I work at home. So like a lot of people, at least mostly, but I would come back in my office and be like, oh, you know what? I'll just work on that other thing or I'll just work later. And I started saying, no, I'm going to do something else in the evening and also going to that unconscious work that your mind does or play. I made a point to go to more plays, go to the museum more, take a couple weekend trips that were just weekend trips, not I'm going to take my laptop and I'm going to get all this work done. And so that plus the relaxation, I was feeding my brain with new sites and new places and different people and artwork and things that would give me ideas, not directly, not like I'd look at a piece of art and be like, oh, this is what I should do. But I'd look around and then an hour later, suddenly, oh, this would be a great, plot twist, or oh, that's why that character did that. Or
Right.
maybe they would think about this, or what a great setting. And that used to just happen to me, I feel like naturally. So at some point, I think I started cutting out too many of those other things and losing that the things that fill up your brain in a good way, in a way that lets you play and meander and think about things without pushing yourself.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like we almost need to think of our creativity as we would even a physical muscle. When we use it, we're working it, we're exercising it, and to your point, maybe we need to put that first every day so we make sure that we're getting that work in. But just like our physical bodies, if we don't rest it, it's really hard to make it keep working for us. And then, excuse me, like you said, going to other places and absorbing other creative things or having experiences is what kind of feeds it. And so even if it's not direct, that's how you start generating more ideas. I really,
And
really
I,
like.
oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, ironically, I had, though I was working a lot, in some ways I had less trouble with that when I was a full-time lawyer because I talked to so many different people all the time. I would talk
Mm,
to clients, I would get to know them, I might hear a little bit of their life stories, I'd go to court, I would hear other cases going on before me, which were totally different. And you're really hearing people's life stories that way. Or I'd travel for business. And even though I was there on legal business, I was taking in all this stuff. And then when that became a very small part of my life, there wasn't as much material and there wasn't as much time when my brain was working on something else, but the back of it was thinking of writing. So it was really strange to realize, oh, I've got to find a new way to do that. Like that used to just happen. And now I've got to purposely be sure there's that kind of input. And I'm much happier with that, but it took me a
right.
while to see that that was happening. The other thing I wanted to mention, I realized, and I probably have had this all my life, I had what my one of my nieces, who's a scenic designer, says she has an optimistic relationship with time, where you always think you're going to get more done, so you overcommit. And one
Right.
of the things I did was to really sit down and realistically look at, okay, these are all the things that I think I should be getting done every week. And I assigned how many hours do I think that will take? And then I multiplied it by 2.5 because generally that averages out to what it really is. And I discovered I had about 70 hours of work every week. And I thought, okay, I only want to work 40. I don't want the life where I'm always working. And that means for a long time, I've constantly either felt behind every day because I'm
Right.
stopping at 5:30 or I'm not wanting to work the weekend, or I'm working on the weekends and I'm working late every night. And then I really looked at, okay, what's the priority? And sometimes I just shifted things. I said, all right, the first quarter of the year, I am not going to record an audiobook, produce it, write a first draft of a novel and get my podcast out and I'll do all these things. So maybe it's I finish this and then I push that other thing to the next quarter of the year. And that used to happen anyway, but I would feel terrible. Like I didn't meet my
Right.
goals. And that
Yeah.
doesn't make you more creative.
No, no, and that's what I was just thinking too. I mean, not only do you not want to be beating yourself up about it, because we know that's just not healthy, but yeah, I mean, we know that if you're trying to force your story, it's because you're putting stress on your brain and then your creativity shuts down. And this is just another way to put stress on your brain, to have all these things going on and then, get down on yourself for not getting everything done when it's like, okay, you're a human being, stop expecting yourself to work 80, 100 hours a week, it's not realistic.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to do it you have a book release this week and it's a push, but if it becomes that's the default and you
Hmm.
feel like you kind of don't deserve to have fun until the work is
Right.
finished, that's something I feel like I just had internalized and not realized it until I heard, I want to say it was Claire Taylor who has a book, Sustain Your Author Career. And I think it was there or in a podcast, she said something about that. And I thought, oh my God, yep, that's me. I'm like, I don't deserve to have fun until I have checked off everything on my list. I
Hmm.
like lists. Lists are good, but they can, they can be too much if you got too many things on them.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I've struggled with that as well. And I think that a lot of authors probably do, not only because we're authors, but I think creative types tend to fall into that trap more easily than non-creative types because more logical people, I mean, first of all, they don't have the push toward the same kind of creativity we do, but they also are very logical about getting rest. You know what I mean? They'll be like, no, I do this, and then I'm done. And we, because we are more nebulous and more expansive, and we have all these things we want to do, we're multitaskers and multi-creatives. We just tend to not be as good about making sure that we're taking care of ourselves, you know?
Yeah, no, and most of us, we started writing, we had other full-time
Right.
work, or maybe we still do. So there's this, okay, like the books give you advice, how much it used to be, how much TV do you watch? You can cut that out and you can write, you can work on your book. And there's something to that because if you need to devote a lot of time to something else, you do have to drop something to write.
Hmm.
But yeah, it becomes a habit. And as you said, if you're someone who has that drive to creativity, you just kind of keep filling things in. I often forget that if I add something in, I have to take something out. So
Right.
I've worked on being better about that too. If I'm going to take on this project, then here's what's not going to get done rather than, oh, I'll take it out of my free time. And like you said, I think that's part of creativity. We see all these things we could do. There's always more things.
Right.
And it's hard to say, nope, I'm not doing that because I still want to do this.
Hmm. Well, and another thing, and maybe this is a good segue into the other thing I wanted to talk about that you mentioned earlier, but I think too, it's something that I learned probably since we last talked, but it's not so much happening anymore. I was working a job that was a very long days kind of job. So you know about that because you've done the lawyering. But for me, it was like, okay, but it's not that I can't take some evening time to work on my book. It's that by then I am so burnt out from the day that
Yeah.
anything I write is just going to need to be rewritten anyway, you know, because my head's not in it. And I think that's something that we don't take into account as well. I like the idea of writing first thing in the morning so that you're getting it done. And of course, not everybody can do that depending on their hours, but we have to, you know, not just assume that, oh, well, I don't have anything scheduled from 5 to 7, so I'll write then. We have to take into account our mental health. If we've been making decisions all day long, then we're going to get decision fatigue and it's going to be really hard to sit down and write something. So we have to I guess it comes back to the same thing. We have to give ourselves time to rest and recoup and recharge our batteries so that our creativity stays high. But I really liked what you said about putting your writing first. I actually, even I've gotten away from doing it every single day. I block off time weekly instead of daily. And I've been thinking that I want to get back to more of a daily practice. But it reminded me of an object lesson that I'm sure a lot of us got growing up. I know that I always got it in church. And it was like putting all these things into a mason jar and trying to make them fit, which is, you know, just an analogy for trying to get everything done in the day and everything done in life. And they would do this thing because there were like rocks and sand and paper and all these different kinds of materials. And if you put the sand in first and then tried to stuff the rocks in, they wouldn't fit. But then they would take everything out and show that if you put the rocks in first, because the sand would filter down into the holes, then it would all fit. So it was just about prioritizing the right things. And then it's easier to get everything done. So even aside from cutting things out, which I think is really important, do you find that by prioritizing your writing and doing it first every day, that you naturally are able to get most everything else done?
Yeah, and I feel better because I have done the thing I like the most. And
Hmm.
I like that analogy because there are times when the fiction writing isn't the first thing that I prioritize. In the year, one semester a year, I teach one course in legal writing. And it took me a while to decide that, you know what, while I'm teaching that, that's my first priority. And it's okay if I don't write as much fiction. So then maybe there's only one day a week that I'm working on my fiction, because it's what you said, the exhaustion factor, the mental exhaustion, because I'm preparing, I'm teaching, that's being on stage in a way, and I'm also grading a lot of student papers and editing them. And that, when I'm done with that, my brain is tired, and it also takes a lot of mental energy to do it. So I like to do that in the morning so that I can be at my best. And it's something that matters to me to give back to the students and to the legal community and to be there for them. So after years of struggling with, oh, but I should also fit in all my writing, I finally thought, you know what, when I'm teaching, just one day a week is fine if that's when I
Mhm.
write. And this matters to me too. So I think there's that as well, and that idea of what is the larger rock that you put in. And it doesn't always have to be your fiction writing. It can be, but there might be times when, there's a month or two when it just can't be. And some of it is having that trust that that's okay, and you can then switch it around when your
Yeah.
priorities shift.
Yeah, and always, maybe getting in the habit, if you start to feel frustrated because you can't get things done, stop and ask yourself, okay, is this working? If it's not, why is it not working? And always maybe reevaluating your priorities for the season of life you're in, which may change weekly or monthly. It's not always yearly or by decade.
Right, right. I used to have this weird feeling as if someone else was in charge of, like, oh, I would just put my head down and move forward once I had set out these goals and tasks, because I'm very goal oriented. And there is that, like, stop. If I feel overloaded, yeah, could I rearrange this? Do I need to shift that priority? And I know there are times in people's lives where you can't. You have certain responsibilities you have to take care of. It is still worth looking at, okay, the things that I can control, pause and take a look and see if they can be moved around a little bit to give yourself a little more breathing room.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, this is such a great conversation because I think this is something that a lot of people, a lot of authors and would-be authors struggle with. And we need to learn to take care of ourselves in this way, our mental health, if we want to sustain an author business, like you were saying. And I know Claire Taylor talks about that a lot too. So why don't we switch gears a little bit and talk about more of the writing side of things, because I know you teach it and you have your book and your podcast, things like learning plot and characterization and theme. I mean, what would you like our listeners to know about that?
This is one great area where you can combine some fun and play with learning if you want to. Sometimes it's good to just read a book to read a book. But those stories that you love, you can learn a lot from. So that's the whole basis of my podcast and the books, is I take one episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer at a time and I break it down. I started focusing on story structure. So I use that, but as the years went by with it, I also tried to look more deeply in characterization and theme and how those work in stories. Because when you really sit down and look at how did the writers do that, the latest book, which focuses on season 3, the second half particularly, has exceptionally good villains. And I really looked at why is that? And I compared them to other shows and other books and other seasons, even of Buffy. And these villains are so multi-layered. They're very human. There are things we empathize with them about, even though one of them is just, no question, clearly evil goals and aims. And yet, we see him being a father figure, genuinely caring for this young woman who is like a daughter to him. And we see him genuinely, he's a mayor, he's genuinely caring about this town that he runs, even though he has all these evil plans. He's making sure that, the water system works right and the police force is out there, taking care of things. And we can empathize with that, even though you don't want him to win. At the same time, I looked at the protagonists and the mistakes they make, that they're flawed and human and sometimes make really bad decisions and have to face the consequences. And for me, that was very educational because I do have a tendency to want to write protagonists who I don't want them to like do the wrong thing. I want them to, be in control and be a model of a healthy human. And that doesn't really make for great fiction generally, and it's not
Right.
it's not human. It helped me to look at in that story I love, those stories I love and those characters I love and get to see developed over seasons, to see how the writers work with that. And it could be any show that you find either exceptionally well written or it really speaks to you. If there's a movie you watch over and over again, a book you read over and over again, there's something in there that really gripped you. And taking the time to sort that out can be a great learning experience as a writer. One of this year's projects, maybe, I'm not sure. I am thinking about taking Pride and Prejudice and doing a book like Pride, Prejudice, and Plot, and really taking whole sections of it because it's in the public domain, and then including here's what Jane Austen did here. Like, here's how she did such a great opening. Here's how she developed these characters in this way. Why do we believe it when Elizabeth
Right.
Bennet is so horrible to Darcy? Like, why do we believe it? And how is that built up? And that's basically what I'm doing with Buffy, and I'll do for myself with other stories I love.
Yeah. Hang on, I'm just taking a note here. So I love that. I mean, I would love, let me know if you do that. I would love a Pride and Prejudice book like that. I very often use Pride and Prejudice as an example, specifically of the romance genre, because it's one that most people are familiar with. So yeah, I use that as an example a lot too, but I usually stay pretty high level. I'm not terribly detailed about it. Um, but yeah, that, and I mean, I think, so to unpack a couple of things, would you say then, just the way that you were talking about it, because villains are, I mean, I love analyzing villains. I love great villains. I think most people do. They're just so fun. But because villains are, like you say, inherently evil, we know they're evil. We know we're not rooting for them to win. But the important thing, would you agree that maybe the important thing to put in to make sure that they are three-dimensional is how they're actually good, because it contrasts with their overall evil. And the same thing is true of protagonists. We know they're overall good and we want to root for them, but showing them make mistakes or how they do things wrong, I mean, that's almost kind of the secret to how you show contrast and make a character 3D. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. There is a place there are stories we go to where we just want the villains to just be evil and the protagonist is the hero. But usually those start falling flat at some point. And yes,
Mhm.
showing the other side or the ways that right a protagonist is very flawed or a villain, yeah, does something really good. And suddenly you have to question, oh, but I thought they were just through and through evil, and yet here they are doing a really decent thing or a really kind thing, or we see how from their perspective, that old thing of everyone's the hero in their own story, from their perspective, why this is the right thing to do. I like that because it brings in, I think it brings in the audience's mind more too, because now as an audience member, you have to start thinking about that. The other thing about complicated villains, because season 3 does that as well, is redemption arcs. Actually, I'll take that back. There isn't a redemption arc in that, but one begins for one of the characters throughout the series. And that can be so engaging as well. That villain who has enough layers that later on they can shift and grow and change and become a better person. And you have to lay those seeds early, or they have to be there. They might just be there as you organically sort out the character. And that can be one of the most compelling stories to tell.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm always a little bit, and maybe you can weigh in on this. People ask me, if it's important to do a redemption arc, should I do a redemption arc? And I always tell them, well, I mean, it depends on your story. If you feel like that's a part of the story, then do it. But at the same time, if you're writing a one-off novel, you probably don't want to be trying to do like a 360-degree villain redemption arc in 50 to 80,000 words, so maybe more like in a series context. But yeah, like you said, it can be really, really compelling. And especially if people have latched onto that character enough and want to follow them more, then, it's just about writing a I mean, like you said, it's a human enough villain, but also one that is very, very distinctive so that they know exactly who this character is and they want more of him or her. I mean, I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's a really good point about the redemption arc for a villain works better in a series because, yeah, if you're going, I mean, I never want to make across the board, has to
Right,
be this,
exactly.
but my gut is if it's a redemption arc in one novel, that's probably your protagonist who's going to start
Hmm.
out this way and make that journey because it could be very challenging. You need your antagonist to be pushing back against the protagonist. And if they're also doing the redemption arc, that could be tricky. I'm sure someone has done it, but I tend to think that they work better in series as well. I did in my Awakening series, there was someone who was kind of a villain in the first book, didn't appear much. Second book, he started developing, and I ended up with a redemption arc that I had not planned, but it fit as the series developed. And if I had tried to do that in book one, I think it would just have made it very complicated and
Yeah.
too many
Yeah.
moving parts. And I also think to your point, I liked what you said about should I do a redemption arc? Well, what story do you want to tell? Do you want to do one? Not if that doesn't speak to you as a writer, then I mean, you
Right.
don't need to do one and it might not work.
Yeah, especially as writers, we should never be, and I just did it, but you don't should yourself,
Yeah.
like you shouldn't be doing anything or should be doing anything. You do what feels right. Yeah. Well, and I was even thinking, I started, while we were talking about this, Star Wars started going through my head, and you could argue that the redemption arc, the original three movies,
Yes.
redemption arc for Darth Vader really didn't start until the third one, until Return of the Jedi. At least not in a way that they were obviously putting clues in for it. Before that, he was just the bad guy. And really, though, all they had him do was make a choice in the final moment. So there wasn't a whole lot of dynamic stuff for Darth Vader, I don't think. But even so, I think that it helped to have known him through the previous two movies. And I don't know, maybe even what I said about them not having clues until the third one doesn't hold up because you do have like if you look at the trilogy as a whole, when Luke found out that was his father, that was like the midpoint or the turning point of the three movies. You know what I mean? So you could argue that there were clues earlier on that was going to happen. They weren't really gung ho with it until the third movie. Anyway, but all I'm trying to say is even if you did something like that where you say, oh, the redemption is just them changing in the climactic moment and making the right decision, but maybe they still die and maybe the protagonist still triumphs. I still don't think that's as effective in a single book because we haven't had enough time to really warm up to the characters and get enough of their motivation and backstory. And we just need more of that if we're going to do a major redemption arc, in my opinion.
Yeah, I want to care about the antagonist enough for it to matter. So that is probably part of it with the Star Wars trilogy is we have seen maybe not that I care about Darth Vader personally, but I care about the effect he has on our
Right.
protagonist, Luke. And you're really invested in that. So, yeah, when you find out this is his father, it is so meaningful that ending to the third movie. And without the first two, you wouldn't have as much of that, and you wouldn't know how big a journey that is for Darth Vader. We don't really follow his journey that in depth, but it's huge. And I do think most of the things that move him that way do happen in that third movie. But yeah, there might now I want to go rewatch. There might be some seeds in terms of just things that he says that tell you, despite that he's acting like it doesn't matter, that he does care
Hmm.
about when he wants to turn Luke. That
Right.
we think it's about achieving dominance over the whole empire and getting rid of the rebellion, but there could be some personal things there. So it
Hmm.
almost adds layers retroactively in a way. I'm assuming the writers planned that, but who knows? It might have just evolved.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, one thing that I always say about that is we're never inside Darth Vader's head during those movies, so we don't know what he was thinking, but we don't deal in movies, we deal in books. So if we were writing that as a book, we could be in his head, or we at least should make sure that the readers understand what his motivations are. And that's really fun to play with, even if you don't do like a point of view from your villain, there are ways to convey what he's thinking, and sometimes that is at odds with what he's saying to the protagonist. So that's really, really fun. The other thing that I actually do teach is that there's different levels of emotion that we want to be playing with in our story, and one of them is the emotions of the journey. Just being on a journey with somebody and kind of watching it and experience it vicariously through our characters creates a lot of emotion in the reader, simply because they've been there from the beginning and seen all the ups and downs and twists and turns and all of that. So when they get to the end, they can't help but feel some emotion for what the characters are going through, just because they've been along for the ride. So I think that that plays into it too. If you shortchange that, then you're just at the very least not going to have as much emotion in the climactic scene as you want.
Yeah, I like that focus, and it's easy to lose track of that because we tend to think of story and plot and even characterization. Sometimes you can skip over those emotions that are happening in the moment as it goes forward. And I agree that that's what really brings readers back, I think, to your writing is that emotional experience.
Hmm.
I loved your point about movies versus novels or short stories where you have access to the character's thoughts, because that is one maybe drawback of learning, or limitation of learning from the stories on TV or in the movies, because we don't have that access. We can guess what they're thinking by what they say and do. So that's great because we want to show that in our fiction. But if you only are looking at movies and TV, that can lead you to not include enough about your character's inner life. And that's one of the strengths of written fiction is we
Right.
can step into someone's head. And it's important to remember that, and yeah, and look at novels and short stories too as models, not only the screenwriting.
Yeah, for sure. I always remember something that somebody told me, I think it was probably in a college class, and they were just saying, when you watch something on the screen, it's all about it can be about their dialogue, but it's very much about their movement, their action, because we're watching them move around. When you're doing a play, it's all about the dialogue, everything, like the characters say what they think and say what's going on. It's all about the dialogue. But in a book, it's all about the inner thoughts. So they're just different mediums that focus on different things. And if you can kind of keep that straight, then you know how to analyze any given form, of story.
Yeah, I like that. And I like that distinction because yeah, in a play, typically you are not close enough to see the actor's
Right.
face. One of the reasons I love small theater, and there's a ton of it in Chicago where I live, is you're closer. So the actors don't have to be as like big about everything, their gestures, their voices, but you don't see the expressions the same way you do in a movie or on a screen. So yeah, that makes sense. That's why the dialogue, it matters in a screenplay, but so much more in a play. And you're right. Then in a novel, it's much more interior, the interiority. When I read a book that doesn't do that, it can still be a good book, but I'm not nearly as engaged with it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And yeah, I like that's a good point about engagement, because books are all about the emotion to get engagement. And if you don't have the inner thoughts, I feel like the emotion's not there because they're not feeling the inner thoughts. You know what I mean? So yeah, I totally agree with that too. All right, well, that's most of the questions I had. Is there anything else you want to talk about or that you would like the listeners to know?
I think we've covered a lot. Like there would be a
Yeah.
ton more things, but yeah, I have really enjoyed the discussion and thank you so much for having me back.
Of course, yeah, I've enjoyed it too. I think that that my listeners will really enjoy it. So tell us one more time about your book that just came out and like where they can find you if they want to follow you.
Yeah, it is Buffy and the Art of Story, Season 3, Part 2, How to Write Characters Readers Will Love or Love to Hate and Plots They Can't Put Down. You can find that and my other fiction and nonfiction at my author website, lisalilly.com. It's LISALILLY. And all the Buffy stuff is lisalilly.com/Buffy.
Okay. I'll make sure and link that in the show notes. All right, well, as we wrap up, then, what would one piece of advice be that you would give to somebody who is still struggling to get their author business, their author success off the ground? What would you tell them?
To focus on what you love writing and try to do that the best, do your best at that and not get too caught up on what are other people doing and whether you should be doing what somebody else is pursuing. You know, focus on what matters most to you.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice. Well, thank you so much for being here and speaking with us. And yeah, we'll have to have you on again, especially if you do that Pride and Prejudice book. That would be fun.
I will let you know. Thank you so much.
Sure.